Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming along. And welcome to our guests, Rolf, Heer and Molly Reynolds. Now, I've had the pleasure to speak with Molly and Rolf over the past several days, and I've come to the understanding that they're quite forensic listeners. And they do sort of kind of listen closely to the words that you use. So I guess consider your questions very carefully because they may take a different interpretation to what you're actually trying to say. And I'm going to start with that example. So I guess I wanted to start with you, Rolf, and where things started from you and your fascination with film.
I'm not really sure. I think sometimes I realise it goes further back than I had than my own sort of history. That because basically my history is that I started a job at age 18 as a storeman, as a job for 2 weeks, and it expanded into 4 weeks and then 3 months. It happened to be the film store of the Australian Broadcasting Commission at the time, and it led to bits and pieces of other stuff at the ABC. But then after 7 years, I ended up in publicity at the ABC, which I loathed and detested, but they liked me very much because I didn't create controversy. And so I had to get out. And I thought, well, I've carted other people's films around for, here's somebody trying to get in. I've carted other people's films around for, over this past, and I've looked at other people's films and I've publicised other people's films, so maybe it's about time I made some of my own. Not knowing how to go about that, in the end, I think I must have expressed a frustration about it somehow, but by then I'm already 26 or 27. And my mother sent a little cutting out of a newspaper saying, apply for the film school. The film school happened to be the new Rolls-Royce elite film school, federal film school that was being set up. And I didn't want to go there because it was, it would be cliquey and there would be feminists there and things like that. But in the end, I saw no other way to sort out my problem. Limited imagination at the time, and I applied, and miraculously I got in. And I do say miraculously because it was so astonishingly competitive. And after 2 days of being there, I thought, this is absolutely where I want to be. This is fantastic. And one of the triggers was 3 feminists wandering the corridors of the film school looking for a colleague with whom they'd got into battle. They were looking for him to bash him up. Oh. And I sympathised with their viewpoint. And I really did. So okay. It was like a conversion. It was like a total conversion.
So from fear of feminists, you became a feminist yourself?
Well, I sort of.
So was part of your education at the time not just around the process of filmmaking, but around, I guess, the history of film and
not particularly. Do you mean at film school?
So you went to film school largely to learn to be a filmmaker, yes?
Yes, and at that time, yes, there was history of cinema, and there was the industry as part of the coursework.
Oh, I don't mean as a part of the curriculum. I mean, were you on an exploration process yourself around film?
No.
Oh, okay.
Not at all. I watched stuff on TV and I went to the movies, but it was not a particular thing. But then, as I say, I think that history is in fact not completely accurate because I think it came earlier. And I have examples of stuff that came earlier where I think, yes, already I was saying I wanted to be, or I thought I might want, and I have no recollection of that though.
Right.
Perhaps it seemed like unachievable. But yes, I come across things where I think, oh, really? Oh yes, I do remember that as well. Now, why?
So if you were to reflect back, are there any titles that you would sort of kind of identify as being important?
Yes, some weird ones. I remember the first film that I saw was a Walt Disney film called Perry. Why do I remember that? I don't know. That was in Holland. In Holland we used to go to the Wednesday afternoon movies with, the shorts and the bits and pieces. When we came to Australia, we were in the migrant camp for close to a year, and in that year so I was 8 years old and 8 years old, and my brother was 9, and we transgressed and we were forbidden. The great punishment that we were given was not to be allowed to go to the movies anymore while we were at the migrant camp. Well, I remember the 3 films that I saw after that. Right. One is called Rob Roy, which is the Scottish sort of Rob Roy, bagpipes and all that sort of stuff. One was a Shirley Temple film, and one was Prince Valiant. Wow. So I remember those. And I remember numbers of films. We used to go to movies quite a bit as a kid. I remember one. The film that woke me up in some sense intellectually, that really gobsmacked me and had me, that really influenced. I'd gone into a sort of a state of not thinking about anything significant, not thinking about the world and stuff like that. And I saw a film which is based on a very bad book, Harold Robbins' book, called The Adventurer. And I could barely talk for 2 days afterwards.
The film was of the same title?
Yes. I think it was directed by Lewis Milestone. I'm not sure.
Okay, wow.
And he would have been quite an old man at that time. Very bad film, but completely, utterly. There were so many. It was about revolutions and how the revolution turns in upon itself, and these were great questions to me that I couldn't answer and that I was interested in. It turned out I was interested in. And so that really was a turning point in some respects.
Really? And Molly, where did it start for you?
Oh, that's a good question. It could be Walt Disney as well. Don't know if anyone's familiar. When I was growing up in Canberra in the 70s, we only had 2 television channels, but one of them, the commercial network, offered at 6 p.m. on Sunday evenings Walt Disney, and this was pre. I started off with Walt Disney, and then I grew into Countdown. And I think for me, in many ways, it was Star Wars that really sort of cemented in me the magic of cinema. And so much so that I saved all my money to buy the Star Wars soundtrack by John Williams, which is a sort of epic classical music. So that was it. And of course, apparently, at the age of 9, I said, I want, when I grow up, I'm going to make films. Really?
This is post Star Wars, it seems to.
I think it must have been post Star Wars, or maybe even just, Sunday nights, Walt Disney, from 6 to 7, yeah.
And what was it about Star Wars that really took you?
That's a good question. I mean, out of space, that was so magical, so real, and so otherworld, I think, and that it was also exceptional filmmaking. That was exceptional filmmaking that was accessible to a child, because I think I could even probably begin to see through the Walt Disney, films and how they were manipulating and how they worked. Yeah. And
have you continued your fascination or love with Star Wars through subsequent iterations?
No, unfortunately. Started with Star Wars, and then I missed a couple, and I'm not too sure where we're at. But I did go and see in the prelude, which is the last one of the. So I think we're up to 9 movies. Never mind the long form drama spin-offs. And I missed from 6, from 4 to. Hang on, I've lost my numbers. 4, 5, 6. So the last 3, I saw one of those, and I found myself laughing aloud in the cinema because I think they'd lost the sense of storytelling. Yeah.
I remember a number of years ago, a friend of mine was a very big Star Wars fan, and I forget which episode it was, but it was like a big bumblebee, and it was running a pawn shop, and had a really caricatured Mexican accent. I thought, this is incredibly racist. I can't believe it. But they didn't seem to see that. I guess if you get caught up in the Star Wars universe, you call it, maybe you lose track of some of those cultural.
And you almost forgive it anything to stay in that world. I think that is in the end what happens, because you don't wish that disillusionment. You don't want to have to reject the Star Wars universe, so you go with it a bit more than you otherwise might.
For sure. Yeah. So then from age 9 to actually being a filmmaker, what was the transition there?
Oh, rebellious years at boarding school, things like that, and I did think that I would become a psychologist. I thought, yes, that's what that's what I'll do. I think that filmmaking thing had dissipated, and it does amuse me that I thought about becoming a psychologist, because I think filmmaking, especially documentary filmmaking, well, not especially, but is a form of psychology. How do we work? How do we engage with the world? How do we engage with one another? And so, but by the time I graduated from school, it seemed that a communications degree was my only sort of was a comfortable place. So that's what I studied when I left, and then worked many years in hospitality and drifted around the edges of filmmaking. And then when digital came to the fore, the internet, I went, this is it. This is art and craft at its very best. So I spent a lot of time in the digital realm and how to do storytelling.
Now, a couple of days ago, you shared with us the film Hospital. Was that something you saw during your communications period?
Yes, yeah, it was. It was. I spoke at the intro to Hospital on Thursday, and it was an interesting thing. I didn't think a lot of documentary, because my only exposure to it was when the teacher would. And why would you show children films in the afternoon after lunch, where they'd roll out the TV screen and they would play some ABC programming, which was about the colonising of Australia, and more often than not I would sort of wake up with a wet sleeve. I'd fallen asleep and dribbled into it. And so, does that happen to you too, Mark?
Not that I'm willing to admit, no.
And so it never much interests me, but then I went off and I did the communications degree, and in fact I think I was pretty well shown in Hospital by one of those radical feminists that Rolf had studied with. It would be someone like Martha and Sarah, who was one of Australia's first female camera people, and I was like, wow. At the same time, Uncle George had given me a subscription to the Sydney Film Festival, and I went, okay, this goes beyond Walt Disney and Star Wars, and it was an incredible world, it really was.
I do recall back when I was in high school, they showed us a film called Mail Order Bride. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Ray Meager. And that's my lasting impression of him. I didn't watch Home and Away very much, so I don't think of him as Alf. I think of him as this sort of kind of wife-beating guy who married a mail-order bride, which is I feel terrible for Ray because he's a lovely guy. Anyway, I guess these experiences certainly influence us. So, how did you guys end up, I guess, coming together?
Oh, that's a whole different story. There's nothing to nothing to do with filmmaking, but
well, it did because
it
was an industry. It was an industry confab outside Adelaide in a place called Port Elliot, which is not far from Victor Harbour, and it was a week of sort of of exploration and play and all those sorts of things between digital people and filmmakers and people who worked with screen, and that was where we met 20 years ago.
Yep.
And then, what was the first project you guys worked on together? Was that Team Canoes?
No, it sort of evolved to the point where there's some things we do together,
okay,
and there's some things we do separately, and there's no particular rhyme or reason as to which one we're doing and how.
The first one was 12 Canoes.
12 Canoes, which was sometime after, and that was really your work. It was Bottom of the Mark, wasn't it?
No.
No, okay.
No, 12 Canoes was first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't really my work, because it wouldn't be the work that it is without your contribution.
But it was basically your vision that was being chased. True. So there's not any particular system to this or whatever. It's just whatever's right at the time.
Okay.
It's probably a really good thing. I think we've probably got the right blend of it, and that we both work in screen, in audio-visual storytelling. But Rolf does, sort of feature drama, and I do feature documentary. So it we have our own space, yet there's a lot of overlap between it.
And how much we work together in each case varies absolutely according to the work and what's being done. For example, the film I've just finished, Molly had peripheral involvement all the way through, but peripheral. With the feature documentary that she's just about finished, I didn't see any of it until very late in the piece, until it was.
But where you're incredibly, I've worked out is incredibly helpful in that I have this tendency with my documentaries to always put the beginning at the end. And more than once, Rolf has said to me, Molly, why don't you try taking this part of the end and put it at the beginning? And it's like, wow, that's a masterstroke. So I think I've made this mistake enough times now that hopefully I've learned it from myself. Yes.
You kind of half answered my next question. I was going to ask what each of you, I guess, bring to the partnership. We talked about filmmaking as being a collective, like a lot of people working together. So I guess, Rolf, what does Molly bring to the projects that she's worked on? How does she make them better?
You mean my projects?
Yes, the ones I guess that you're taking the lead on.
Look,
being a good devoted wife.
Well, let's phrase it all a bit differently. There's that aspect to it. It wouldn't be any fun at all making anything if Molly wasn't around and part of it in some way or other. Mm-hmm. And I think I would not find the passion required to do these things, without you. What's the point? It almost feels like, what's the point? So there is that for me, very, very, very important. When there are different phases, of course. So when I'm writing, I have certain particularities, like I want to be left alone, basically. Don't ask. Mm-hmm. And by being supportive and not asking, fulfills a major function to get him through that process of writing.
I was reading it at night when he's sound asleep.
yeah. But equally, Molly will see the work and make comment, and I'll go away and think about that. And sometimes it'll make a big difference, and sometimes it makes very little difference. And, it's variable. It's all variable.
On the case of Rolf's last project, the survival of kindness, I saw the work at a rough cut stage in which I made a set of notes, and it was playing very well then. And I didn't care to see it again because I knew that any contribution that I could make would be minor, and that there was redundancy in that the team that work on it would that if there was if the sound dropped out in some part, somebody was going to pick that up along the way. It wasn't for me to do it, which meant that when I saw the film, which premiered at the Adelaide Film Festival about 3 weeks ago, it was something to behold, for me. It was a really, really special screening rather than it being, like one of my own films in which I had worked on. Yeah.
And I don't know if this is a good, analysis of the relationship in a sense, but does Molly in some ways bring a documentary eye to what is, like a fictional feature film, and is that somehow valuable?
I don't think it's about that in particular, because I think Molly is as educated in the language of movie making, of movies, the way movies play, as in documentary. And so, I think we are all of us much more educated in film grammar than we think, and so an aspiring filmmaker has actually much greater knowledge of film than they realise, and they're usually much better at it if they step in and say, I'm a filmmaker, then hang on, please. So I think that when Molly makes comment on the survival of kindness, it is in its role as a feature film. I mean, that's 20 years ago at the Sydney Film Festival, you see a lot of films, and you are educated in film grammar to a great extent. And if you're confident enough to articulate it, then it's a valid viewpoint. Yeah.
It's interesting, Rolf, his sort of filmmaking process. He certainly is very much an auteur and independent filmmaker, and he wisely says to anyone, the only notes I'll take are in writing, because often when you get a film financed, it involves public money from Screen Australia, a state funding agency, etc., and rightly so. They ask to look at the project at various stages, and Rolf will always say, I'll take your feedback, but in writing only, because it's just simply too easy to shoot off at the mouth and to make sort of loose, meaningless contribution.
Yes, and to be able to keep interpreting what is, because the great danger in all of this is that people sound convincing, but what does it mean? And I was very lucky on the second film I ever did to learn this great lesson, where I understood that actually nobody really knows. Okay, so firstly, in the process of making it, I came to grief with the executive producer who had a lot of power, and that was in post-production. He'd seen Rushes, he was very happy with it, and then then suddenly in post-production he wanted everything changed, and when it was a film that was it was structured in flashbacks, and it was a detective-ish, science fiction-y sort of thing. and he suddenly wanted it all to be put into sequence. It didn't make any sense to do that at all, none. And so we fought, and he fired me, and then he had to rehire me, and because I took the sound tapes and I hid them, and it was catastrophic. So he came, and we went through the film, and we made changes, and we agreed, and we sort of agreed, but then he still wanted it in sequence, and so I thought, okay, I'll get you, and so I did 3 versions of it in sequence. And in those days, of course, we were cutting on film, and the only way you could sort of do this, you have an old Steenbeck editing machine that makes quite a bit of noise when you or whatever, and you do a VHS copy off the Steenbeck screen, and the sound is off out of that speaker, and all the sound of the wheels going it's terrible, the quality is shocking. So he had 6 hours of viewing to do. There were 3 versions, and I knew he would never look at them. Okay, so this went on for months, and in the end, we had to look off, and I said, we have to know that. And he says, okay, well, lock the fucking thing off then. Okay, and so we locked off and we finished, because most of the arguments I had with him, I'd say, no, the sound is going to be, which of course in those days you could only have 1 or 2 bands of sound and whatever. Anyway, he was the most experienced by far producer in Australia. And when we did the mix, we did all the sound, and then he saw it again, and he walked on air. He was so happy. And to this day, will not believe that we didn't totally recut the film when we didn't change a single frame of it. And so I understood he had no idea, okay? And he's the best. He's the most experienced, okay? And then with that film, it ultimately went and was released in the UK. And it was a big thing for me. The distributors in the UK sent me the reviews, and they photocopied them all beautifully. And here was this, and I was in Paris at the time, preparing to do Dingo, and it was very exciting. So I thought, okay, I'll find a nice little quiet spot, and I did, and began to read. And I remember the beginning of the first review, and it said, Australians make some very bad films, ... This is the worst of them. And it was this kick in the guts, it was shocking. And it proceeded to justify its position, and did it very well. And I'm going, oh no, this is awful. Anyway, read the next review. Oh, Jesus Christ. Terrible. And the next one, no. But there were 42 of them. And gradually they got better and better and better and better and better and better. And I remember the last line of the last review said, this film is a work of genius, ... Tarkovsky with pace. All right, now, and everything in between, from beginning to end, was different. And you think, everybody's, seeing the same film. There's not a frame for the film that's different. What's going on here? And then you realise everybody's seen a completely different film. Everybody has seen a completely different film. So, if you're in the process of making and you get comment, yes, how do you interpret that comment? Because that person sees a different film than that person over there, and that person would comment differently. No, that's actually really good. What this person said was really bad. So I'm very wary now of, and I've seen scripts ruined by people taking too much comment about a script, and you say, look, where's that first draft that you did? Go back to that. Yes, that's good. Now, you've tried to satisfy everybody, and you've ended up writing a script that's bad. And so I'm very wary of comment, and the written stuff is important because it forces people to think about it instead of just go that. And you can interpret it and reinterpret it and think, no. Not going to do that.
And I think that's the thing as well, is that in taking feedback that you do learn how to interpret. And go, oh, that's a fair comment. Yes, that will improve it. Or no, that doesn't sit well or easily for me. I think it's about having confidence to be able to respond to those notes, and rather than feel an obligation to work with them. Yeah.
Just based on what you said, I guess I've got two questions. One is, did they intentionally put the worst reviews at the front and the best ones at the back?
They must have done.
Okay.
Yes, they must have carefully sort of worked it out from the worst to the best.
Was there not a danger that you would go, oh shit, and then...
Oh, it didn't matter. What danger to them? No.
I guess so,
Yeah.
And I guess the production
And then
process...
going to ask which film it is?
Sure.
Well, just because, you know.
It's Incident at Raven's Gate,
Okay.
or also known as Encounter at Raven's Gate. It's both those titles.
I was going to ask too, the production process sounded a little bit chaotic because of those interactions with the producer. Is that a really critical part of, I guess, the final product? Does that impact significantly on what you end up producing, or is it a little bit of a random event?
Oh, it can do, but it was part of the process that led me into becoming the sort of filmmaker that I am.
Okay.
In that I thought, he's the best, and he hasn't got a clue.
But by what definition was he the best? The best of what?
By far the most experienced, knowing the most, well, best is best is the word that doesn't matter so much. I had problems with producers in the first three films, and so after that I thought, okay, well, bugger it, I'll do it myself. I don't have to. This is not good filmmaking process.
So back to where we started, Molly, I guess you did mention that Rolf's good structurally with your films. Is that what you're saying?
I think
no.
that's too much.
Yes, I protest.
Oh, I apologise.
No, but I think that's the nature of Rolf. He gives very good feedback, and what I do is I call it keeping the gunpowder dry. So I pretty well am sitting between rough cut and fine cut stage when I'll ask Rolf to have a look at it. He's one of the few people. I tend to keep a very what's the word, closed shop, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Where there's only a few people that I like to kind of have input on that. Another person is Sue Murray. I think she has had a look at everything and for their input to come in, because for me as a filmmaker, I allow myself to get potentially confused if there's too much coming in. I kind of go, I know what I'm reaching for, so I proceed with confidence. Yeah.
I think it's also, for me, it's important to know the people from whom the notes come, because you can then interpret better. Like there's an editor I worked with who had a very particular view of the way music is and works, and I loved working with him. I did the first 4 films playing with him, but I could tell if he didn't like it, it's probably very good.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah. And once I learned how to work with him on that, it worked very well.
Great.
And so I think those things are important. And I was, particularly if you end up making films yourself, with notes, you get really stupid ones, and quite a large proportion of them are often exceedingly stupid. Okay, they're completely, they think, you think, what planet are you on? And remarkable how many notes are bad.
Well, a good example I often find of what is a silly note is a note where you can't change the feedback. You know, that would be terrific if the telegraph wasn't in shot. Well, it's like, no, that telegraph is there to say, so why make that comment? I think that's
Yep,
a good
there's a lot of
example.
those. I find that if you can ignore a great many notes, just ignore them because that's stupid. And then there are the notes where it's clearly, well, that's interesting. That's a different, you know, it can be just a different way of looking at it. And you think, well, yes, no, it doesn't matter. You know. But the interesting notes are the notes I don't like, but they resonate. There's something in them that resonates, and I don't like them. And I think, yes, I've been denying that there is this problem or something. If it resonates, then you ignore them at your own peril. And then there's the question of finding out how to deal with them, because sometimes the resonating of the note means it is something you should take notice of. But maybe the solution is not to do what the note says maybe you should do, but there is another reason for it. And so you explore all that and so on. Yeah.
So, I don't know if I'm hearing you correctly, but in some ways all feedback is useful. Some of it confirms that you're on the right track. Some of it becomes an open question, and some maybe advice you take on board and change.
All those notes that I think is like about 60-70% of feedback is completely useless.
Useless?
Yes.
Useless is a better word than stupid. Stupid is yes.
Yeah. It's just useless, unthought through.
Okay.
Like Molly was saying, well, what am I going to do? I can't do it. The film is called that. I can't change, you know, this sequence that is the thing that calls the film what it is,
right.
Sort of thing.
And I think there's also that bind where often I always, you know, I don't think when someone has asked you a question, does cheese make you happy or sad? Cheese doesn't make, you know, most people feel happy or sad, but if asked a question, you're going to choose one over the other. Cheese makes me feel happy. That is, you know, there's no sort of integrity in that answer, but it is an answer to a question. And I think that often with feedbacks or comments that people have about films is basically sits in the psychology of human behaviour. I'm asked to make a contribution here. How do I make a contribution? So rather than saying, you know, oh look, you know, there's no comment to be made here. There's a kind of, and in fact, useless is not a great word, nor is stupid. It's probably meaningless. Is probably what we're reaching for.
Wow.
The word.
Some of it is stupid.
Well, but then that is that's unfair on the person who makes it.
No, completely fair. I tell you now. I can.
No.
I won't.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did say you guys were forensic listeners, so there's often multiple interpretations on the correct word for a situation. Okay, now this is a story I heard some time ago about Rolf and an encounter that you had with Harvey Weinstein.
Yes.
Do you want to share that story?
I don't know what the story is.
Oh, okay. My story was
I've
that
had multiple stories. I've had multiple encounters with Harvey.
Okay, very good. We'd love to hear all of those. But
Have you ever been alone in a bedroom with him?
or shower.
He found it particularly unattractive.
Excellent, lucky you. I think he was interested in distributing one of your films, and I think at that stage you'd already attached it with another distributor, and he made some kind of not very veiled threat about kneecapping you or something as a result.
No.
Nothing like that?
I don't know that.
Okay.
I met him first when I was in America with Dingo, after the film had been finished, and he was snooping around the projection box that was being projected to an American company of some sort, and he was snooping around, being completely inappropriate and completely had nothing. It was outrageous. His company bought Epsilon, which was the 5th film I made, I think. And they, look, it's such a long story. It was a disastrous
acquisition.
Well, acquisition, but yes, it was a disastrous sort of interplay between the film and the screening and his view. It was the Australian Film Commission, not the Australian, who was it at the time? Film Finance Corporation at the time, had to take him to court because he didn't want to pay. And it just went on for years. And it held the film up completely for 2 or 3 years, at the end of which it was dead, whole film, and nobody. So, and he's extremely unpleasant. He's an extremely unpleasant, nasty, criminal person, and he deserves everything he's getting and more. I have no doubt at all about that.
And did his success come from being able to bully the right people into working with him? Is that?
No, he must have had skills as well.
Yeah.
I just didn't see them particularly.
No.
In terms of because he could make decisions and he could greenlight films. People were very respectable of him for a long time. I mean, it's been a great story. Everybody's had their problems with him. There's a great Peter Jackson story where Peter Jackson made a film called, oh my goodness, it's gone. It was a New Zealand film about
Heavenly Creatures.
Heavenly Creatures, thank you. He made Heavenly Creatures. Very interesting film, very lovely film. Hard film, as well. And Harvey bought it, but demanded that he cut it. And he didn't want to cut it. And Harvey said, look, it's got to be cut there, and it's got to be cut there. You know that, blah, 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 no arguments, no. Okay, in the end, we'll have a test screening. So, they had the test screening. And Peter Jackson sits in the test screening, and Harvey proves to be correct. At that particular spot, there's quite a lot of audience dissent. And there's people getting up and walking out. Okay. And at the second place, equally so, people slamming their seats and fuck this and blah blah. And so, tail between his legs, the next day he went back to Miramax and got in the lift and pressed the wrong button. And he got out the floor below, which is also Miramax. And there, working at desks and things for Miramax, were the people who were slamming seats and swearing, and they'd been planted by Harvey to do exactly that during those times.
Wow. And what was the end result? Did they make the cuts?
He went up there and said, "Get fucked." I know what you're up to. Yeah. So that's the sort of person he is.
Right. Interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
And Molly, I guess you've had both of you have had a long-standing relation with David Gulpilil. Did you want to have any sort of kind of great stories you wanted to share? I think the answer is yes.
No.
Oh,
It's just the
it's too big a question.
No, it's okay.
David Gulpilil. David Gulpilil, I would say, will be forever one of Australia's great actors, and for many years, I'd say, it's a great Indigenous actor. And I thought, goodness, why do I qualify that? So he is one of the great actors. He was incredibly mercurial, difficult person. He could be very manipulative and very, very cruel. And that was for a couple of reasons, I think. I think he's, culturally, his people were, when he was born, they were still living in the bush. And living in the bush is not an idyllic, wholesome life. It is very, very brutal, there was, there's a lot of spearing going on, and it's just not kangaroos. And I think that David, he was corrupted by our culture, the dominant culture, and he developed, he had these addictions, both with alcohol and marijuana, and it certainly brought on a different state of mind. He was not mentally robust when he was under the influence of these drugs. And so yes, he could behave badly, and there are some fantastic stories. I mean, I could keep us all going until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But the great pleasure of working with My Name is Gulpwell is that when we learnt that David was unwell and headed over from Tasmania to Murray Bridge outside Adelaide to pay our respects, and David was keen to work again, and the only way we could see that happening was as a documentary. There was no way Rolf could cast him in a film with the turnaround time, with the financing, with everyone saying, what are you doing? Casting a dying man. Little did we all know that he was going to live for another 4 years. But that aside, and I thought, I really do not want to work with David again. But I understood the sense of obligation that I had, both as an individual and as an Australian who's sort of in the dominant culture as a white fella. And so I thought, yep, I can do this. I don't care. I cared for David, but I didn't enjoy his company so much. But I thought, goodness, I can make a better documentary for it because it wasn't so thorny. And the fabulous thing, I think, for both of us over that 4-year period was David had given up all his addiction, so he no longer drank when he came out of prison, and shortly before he was diagnosed with his widespread stage 4 lung cancer, he'd given up smoking the ganja. And so I think we had an insight to a sweeter David, a David before he was corrupted by our culture. And how did I know that? And I think I knew it because in my brief period as Australia's leading expert on David Gulpwell, I had seen all the archival footage, and there was someone really quite lovely there, quite in awe of the world.
In the young
David. Very young David. And I think we're both very, very relieved for him that he was able to return to that in the final years of his life, that he could, as his carer Mary would say, that he restored his good name, because yes, he could be a terror.
Beyond, I guess, letting go of the addictions, do you think that having a terminal diagnosis changed his attitude as well, or no? No,
David didn't quite have the toolkit for it.
Okay.
He never dealt with it at all well. I think in the documentary, he had moments of coherence and wisdom, but I think that in part was him as the great actor, the great performer, knowing what was required of him. Another one which would put Rolf and I in such a jam was that, yes, I want to go back home to country. Country is where I want to be. And he knew that us white fellas needed that for our sense of what it is to be a First Nations person is this incredible spiritual connection to country. And David gave it to the white fellas, and then all the white fellas would turn to us as carers and say, well, if he wants to go back to country, why isn't he there? And we're like, he doesn't want to go. And they say, but he says he wants to. And we go, he really doesn't want to go because we worked so hard and so many efforts to say, David, if you want to go, we will get you there. And he balked every single time. So he was, he was quite masterful, really, in many ways. But to go back to your question, Mark, did he, no, he didn't. he didn't cope very well at all. He sort of was a white fella's disease, and I think he thought, he was sort of outside his realm. Yeah.
I don't know if this is my individual interpretation, but watching I Am Gopal, I got a sense that he was somewhat philosophical about the choices he'd made and how that had led to where he was, and he was working very hard to capture as much of his life on film before he passed away. But that wasn't your experience?
That I would, I think yes. He wanted. I think there's a great line that he says, "This is my story about my story," and he was very, very keen to own that story, and it was one of the reasons why. And because we knew he could speak directly to his audience, that he's one of those people who stares down the lens, and I don't know what happens to him, but he sees something.
And the lens sees something.
Yeah, the lens, and so he was very keen for that, and that's why we gave David, his voice. Yeah.
That's sort of what I might call logical interpretation of David and what he showed in the film. He is just not capable of that. And it goes back to language, because English is very much his fifth or sixth language, and he has no subtlety in English. He's occasionally flukes it, but mostly he has.
Poet.
Yeah, poetic, but it's different to being subtle. It's poetic half the time. But conceptually, the two languages are about two different universes. They're two different cosmologies, and there's not a lot in common between the two cosmologies. And so his internal language is very badly equipped to deal with any of these sorts of ways of thinking. And he just basically doesn't have those sorts of thinking. And I know there's a tremendous amount going on when I work with him that I simply can't access. And he can't really access what's going on in my head. He's learned a bit about it and how to deal with it and so on. But so, for example, when you talk about choices made, I can't, when I consider that John Mellion, actor John Mellion, who used to do BB commercials, taught David then being 16 years old, taught David how to act sober whilst in a state of drunkenness. So as an actor, you become drunk, and not as an actor, as a person you become drunk, but now you've got to play sober, and this is how you do it. And so that was his his first great role model as an actor. And I don't know how much choice did David have in terms of becoming drinking far too much?
Well, an alcoholic.
Yeah.
It says I'm a drug and alcoholic.
Yep. His second great role model was Dennis Hopper. On Mad Dog Morgan, and David still was crowing about, we got locked up together 10 times, and all this sort of stuff, and you go, that's very, So, this is what actors do. He was born under a tree, the nearest chemist shop was 400 kilometres away.
But to be fair, I think it's not so much, Dennis Hopper and John Mellion. The truth of it is that Australia is a nation of alcoholics. Our alcohol consumption. Yes. So I think David would have succumbed without such exemplary. Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, just so to the audience, have you guys got any questions you want to ask Rolf or Molly?
You go back a long time, you go back to the time of cutting film and machine, etc. So now we've got digital editing and the like. We can bring Terry Fisher back from the dead. What are the advantages and disadvantages with high technology?
The disadvantages are that you don't get the time to think in the same way anymore, and there's a loss of discipline where you have to think about it and then make a decision. Is this the right decision? Consider that and go, okay, well, let's have a look at it. Because every time you cut the film, it cracks the splice, and it becomes harder to see.
It's okay, I'll fix that.
Yeah. Now, and while the splice is happening, the editor is going, okay, marking it up, putting it. There's time to think about where you're going and what it is, and so on and so on. Now it's just pressing buttons so quickly, and it's very hard now to get an editor to stop and think because they just go, have a look at it, have a look at it. Oh, you want a short? Go. And it's the same on set. You have trouble with actors now who understand that in the digital domain it costs nothing more to do it 5-10 times. Okay, because film stock used to be such a high proportion of your budget. And you don't need to. They say, look, it's only space in a memory card. And you say, and so it's a different way of doing things, which is more, I'll try it this way, I'll try it this way, I'll try it that way, which I think, for some people is of advantage. But what it means is you've got 5 times as much stuff in post-production, 5 times as much material to look at, and you can never deal with it properly, unless you have this immensely long post-production time. And on set, even the crew are less disciplined because it doesn't matter and used to matter. But equally, you can, people save all their cuts and they can go back to a previous cut in a really interesting way, and it saves time and they get more time. If you've got the same amount of time in post for the same amount of material, you actually can deal with much more of it more quickly, and so I'm used to it, but I don't entirely like it. For me, the worst thing is it's now practically impossible to shoot a film where you can look through the camera and you are actually looking through the lens instead of at a viewfinder. And so you can't anymore enter the world of the film by looking through the viewfinder, because the resolution is not good enough, and it's like watching a little tiny TV screen. It doesn't work, and that for me is the hardest thing, because I would, for example, the shot we set up, and I'd look at it through the viewfinder. And people got used to me. He'll be there for a minute or two, and I'm just looking, and I'm entering the world of that film. Can't do that anymore. I
don't know if you're familiar with other directors' processes, but like in the celluloid era, a lot of directors used a great deal of rehearsal before they started shooting. Is that a thing in the past as well?
I think there's look, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm sure there are now directors who don't rehearse at all. Mm-hmm. But I make choices about that depending on what the situation is. Mm-hmm. And you have to learn from your actors, because some actors gradually work their way up to a peak, and you don't know exactly where that peak is. It might take 3 or 5 or 7. Whereas other ones, from the very first block through, they nail it, and they gradually get worse. Mm-hmm. And so how do you work those two actors together? It's always tricky. On a film, like 10 Canoes, for example, I learned on the second day never to rehearse anything, ever, because it will always get worse every time.
And on Kent News, there wasn't, the mob up there didn't have a sense of the difference between rehearsal and the real thing.
That's right.
And so it, yes, that.
Yeah. But they would get it first time if you spoke well enough, and you know, you all got to understand what was happening. They would get it, and they would be there. They wouldn't be playing their ancestors. They would be their ancestors. And every time every time you did another take, it felt less like that for them, and so they got less good. So then it was all, how do we design this to be able to get it first take?
It's almost like you said that, you know, with people with discipline, you know, you have a limited number of takes. That's almost going back to that, isn't it?
Yes.
It's not your first time.
Yeah.
And did you have experience with celluloid modelling or not really?
Oh, no, I cut on a stone deck. I began as an assistant editor, and I had to log all the rushes, and I had to trim bin, and the job that I once did, I had such a fast and furious deadline that I threw all the trims onto the ground. And I did make deadline, but there was about a month there where to kind of get to my start back in the corner of the reel, and I kind of had to walk through a mountain of film that came up to my knees. So, yeah, I had a sample of that, and what happened was that was at the time where film was converted over to digital, to videotape, and we had this crazy thing called an AB roll. So you'd have to crudely sync up with this dial the videotape and then hit play at exactly the same time so it could feed into a third, and that was how you used to cut in the early days of videotape. So,
wow.
Yes. I've had just samples of those. I quite like digital now. There's something very easy about.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just thinking, because you're in the same field, do you do collaborative projects together, or would that be to sort of practice at a personal level? And the other question was, if you do stick to your original vision, do people see you as stubborn or difficult or whatever, and how do you get around that, or do you just power ahead? Or?
Okay, let's take the first question. When we do collaborate, one of us is the chef and one of us is the under chef. And because we tend to be slightly different fields, it works well. I profess no particular expertise with documentary. I know what I think, and I can make suggestions for contribution, but I would never say you have to do this.
Which is a great way to answer your next question, which is, I think one can hold on to vision or plan, or whatever it is, that we set out to do in our lives. I think it's about treating others with grace during the process, so that if someone has feedback to give you or whatever else, that it's how you kind of receive that and respond to that with grace. And we, both of us, have this thing about you never ever know what's going to happen to a film that you've worked on. It may be your best film, it may come to be considered your very, very best film, but at the time it might just disappear into nothing. So that you've spent a year of your life working, or several years of your life working on it, that time frame ought to be good, because there may be nothing else to show for it.
Yes, it's for me. It's the most important thing is process, because if process is bad, then I'm wasting my life and wasting the life of other people. The process is good, and I love Molly's word, grace. You know, for me, it's Molly's word. Then the work for me has a better chance of flowering if the crew and the cast are part of the process in a graceful way. They all have a special time, and I think, now I feel very privileged to have done what I've done and been able to whatever. But equally, I know here that these people who are the first time they've ever done a film where they're engaged with it in fully and so on, and it becomes their best experience. And so I've had all these great experiences all the time, but it comes from the top. You know, how you deal with that, and so it's having learned how to deal with that process is the most. And look, in the end, you do recognise, you know, when people say you're being stubborn and whatever, but I know now what I'm doing, you know, and I know when I'm being stubborn and when I'm not being stubborn.
These days, is it harder to get funding without doing really elaborate submissions and so much paperwork, but online? Like in the old days, was it easier just to approach someone and talk one-to-one about your vision sort of thing, whereas now it's fill out 100 pages and submit, you know?
In the old days, there was less money around, but you could fluke upon it and get it more easily. Yes, certainly. Now there's sort of more money around to do these things, but the complications are stupendous.
Oh, okay.
The difference, I've seen it because I do a lot of the contracting and so on, and it just started to go like, it hasn't stopped.
Something I think on Rolf's most recent film, Survival of Kindness, there was something like 450 contracts that to kind of satisfy all the various stakeholders.
And it's relatively low budget.
But to get to that point, I think one way Rolf has been able to make the films that he has made, and as many, is that a certain ingenuity and flexibility in thinking, and low budget is one of those things, because if something is low budget, then you're able to raise the money more quickly. The risk is seen as less because you're talking about 1.5 million, not 8 million. And then there's a quicker return to investment. But then the trick is to look at what low budget is, and rather than see it as a negative constraint, to see it as a positive constraint, and that there with it can come a different set of flexibilities. And I'm speaking for you now, Rolf, so I may as well continue.
I'm listening with interest.
Is that Rolf now recognises the value in a small crew, and he will advocate to any first-time filmmaker, you are far better shooting with a crew of 12 or, sort of 15 over a 10-week period than having a crew of 50 over a 4-week period or a 6-week period. And it's, there's ways of when it comes to filmmaking, there's ways of making it happen, and we're not so much with this collective here talking to a group of aspiring filmmakers, but in many ways there are no excuses. That's if you want to make something and you really, really are committed to that, then part of it is finding the way.
Is insurance one of the biggest take is of what funding you get? Like, is that getting more and more expensive, insurance?
Well, if you're in the US and you've got firearms, probably.
No, it's stayed about the same percentage of budget. Yes, there's more and more push that you must be fully insured in every respect.
Everyone's scared of getting sued these days in litigation. And I
Yeah.
tripped over this, 3 million, thank you, you know?
Yeah, that's it. Yes.
So is there more money around now that you've got people like Amazon and Netflix, etc.? Is the future of film not necessarily in the cinema?
There's a lot of, Rolf doesn't even know what Amazon is.
Lucky Rolf.
No, there's a lot of industry agitation and lobbying from, the relevant bodies saying we need to have quotas of Australian content on screens. So, for example, with the ABC and the commercial free-to-airs, they had quotas. Murdoch successfully, with Foxtel, successfully lobbied, and I think partnered up with 7 and 9 as well, successfully lobbied the Australian government to lift that quota system during the beginning of the pandemic, because they said we can't satisfy it, knowing full well that once lifted, those quotas wouldn't be returned. And the streamers have no quotas, and so they make a big show about Australian content, but it's a problem. And I think if they wish to operate in this space, that they should have a certain commitment.
Yeah.
How do you know when you've got a good story? That's worthy of,
Okay. My view is that almost any story can be a good story. It's how beautifully is it executed that matters. Okay, so some of the most lovely films are about a small, inconsequential thing, and they're beautifully done, and you watch it and you are enriched by it. So, good ideas are a dime a dozen, and they are. There are so many wonderful ideas for films around. It's not about that. It's about how beautifully are they executed. Another great lesson that I learned is about writing. Okay, so that writing becomes the most important thing. For me, half of making a film, half of directing a film, is the first half, which is the writing. Now, each of us here is relatively articulate, so we can put words into an order that then communicate what we wish it to communicate. When I started out, it was I was not a writer at all, and but I read a lot of scripts, and there was a friend of mine who belonged to the Writers Guild, who was a writer, and he would have to come back with things like, a good script is only 10% inspiration, but it's 90% perspiration. And so I thought about this, and I would read scripts, because there was a particular reason why I was reading all these scripts, and I would think, oh, well, that's a 40% script, I suppose. It's not very good. Oh, there's a 60% script. Yeah, okay, good. And I thought, okay, and then I was put into a position where I needed to write a script. I thought, okay, I'll do it. And I thought, okay, if I put in 100% perspiration, and by my standards, that's a lot, I'm willing to work very hard to get this upbringing where, blah, blah, blah. Then I'm going to end up with a 90% script, because I'm not an artist. I don't, I have 5 siblings, each of them are more talented than I am, etc., etc. But I can end up with a 90% script. if I put the full effort in, and that will be better than most scripts that are going around. And it's true. Okay? But what's not true is that I have no inspiration, because if you work as deeply and as hard as you need to, you inevitably set up things happening in your brain, and you do have inspiration. But and it enables beautiful execution. Okay, so most of us here are capable of making lovely work. Yes, we get better. I mean, my scripts after 5 years became better than they were 5 years previous. But it is about execution. Your idea, yeah, you can tell me 5 ideas and I'll say, look, I prefer this idea. I think it'll be an easier road to whatever, or I would prefer to see that. But each one of them, if you do it well enough, will work.
How much freedom do you give your actors with the script?
It depends on the script and it depends on the actors. There's no easy answer. At times I'm very particular, but I've learned that the process of casting can be very difficult, because what you've written the script, and at that point it's where you want it to be. It's perfect. The minute an actor comes in, it's not the same. They're not what I had in mind. They can't be, unless I had written it for a particular actor, which sometimes I do. And so you have to already let go. And I've learned to ask questions on set of myself, where something happens, or a suggestion is made, or an actor asks, "Can I do this?" And I've learned to answer them, to ask them of myself and answer them very quickly. Is it better? Is it worse? Or is it just different? Okay? And if it is just different, does it work anyway? Okay? So, if it's better, I'll say, yes, please, let's do that. If it's worse, I have to be able to justify why it's worse. I have to be able to articulate why it's worse. I can't just say, no, don't like it. And if it's just different, I think, well, that's okay then. Let go of that. Give it to the actor.
Have you had actors go rogue, though, just completely off script?
Oh.
David Goldberg.
Yes, but you know.
In a good way.
No. Sometimes in one film there was an actor who had to deliver in a sense, almost the final line of dialogue in the film, which was which sort of explained the whole film in a sort of way, and he was meant to say such and such yes, it was a yes statement, but he refused. He would only say the no statement, which was the opposite of what was intended of the film. And it was the last day of the shoot, and he knew that the crew, still in the days when I used to use bigger crews, that the crew was waiting for the party that night, because it was the rap party and blah blah blah. No. He wouldn't. In the end, we had to find it. It was shocking. It was really never. Anyway, so yeah, it goes anyway. But mostly, no. I have a good relationship with actors because I respect what they do, and I try and understand the difficulties that they have.
Yeah. Is there an actor that you would really like to work with?
I don't know. No, because if I haven't already worked with them, I don't know if they're good to work with them.
Is it hard to have a balance between you've got something you really want to express and that's what's driving you, inspiring you want to get it out, but also we're in an era of a lot of political correctness and people want to hear this and don't want to hear that, and they're expecting this, and such is no-no, and oh, we're so high-bound by these days. Is that therefore difficult to have a balance between the two? Do you have to
Yes, of course.
compromise a lot?
Look, it depends. No, well, it depends what it is. Yes, I'm quite pleased. I've been able to make the films that I have been able to make, some of which I probably wouldn't have been able to make now. And I understand that, and I understand, and quite often it's right that I can't now. Who am I? You know, middle class, middle-aged, male, whatever, privileged, etc., etc. Okay, times are shifting. You know.
Well, yeah, I sort of see it slightly differently than that. That it is, for me, I'm using words like grace and kindness today. It must be because it's a Sunday morning. But, as a documentary maker, I think that, I've got a universality of approach in the way in which I deal with things, and that to be a good documentary maker now in 2022 or a good documentary maker 20 years ago, for me there is no difference, because I should be looking after my people, my subjects well, that I'm taking good care and consideration of them. And so, for example, both of us have done a lot of work in Rangining, which is a township in northeast Arnhem, and where the Yolngu people, Yolngu clans live. And there is a reason why we keep being invited back. And our process hasn't changed from now, from 20 years ago to now. And for me, it's about the universality of treating people well. And that, then it's okay. At the screening of Bad Boy Bubby, someone asked the question of, well, how was it for the disabled people? The film was made 35 years ago. I suppose you didn't ask permission. So which is like, well, no, of course you ask for permission, Some people may not have 35 years ago, but, Rolf as a filmmaker were, treated those cast members as he did with any others. So, yeah.
I'm sort of thinking though, say you were doing your documentary, whatever, and the person was saying what they really thought, and you thought, oh God, that's not going to go down well. If, like, the public's not going to like that, shall I just discreetly cut it out? Do I leave it in?
So you're actually asking, who am I looking after here? So
yeah,
if the talent says something
the public's very these days. You only have certain views and not other views, or else, I don't know, funding wise, and
I'd say that, okay, so you interestingly are making the question more and more complex with more and more things involved, which is the answer that you can't give you one answer for that. Okay, each one of those things has to be considered on its own merits. Because yes, you're right. If you can't make the film at all by sticking to a principle, then you have to consider whether that's a principle worth sticking to. And that's an individual thing for that. Yes. And there are many more of those sorts of decisions that have to be made now, but they are all individual decisions, and they all have particular meaning in the particular situation, and I can't begin to advise you one way or another about them, because they are so specific. They're specific to place, to individuals, to the situation, to the content,
Yeah. Yes. But it's also about boldness and integrity, and it makes me think about this bloody stupid headline that was on ABC Online yesterday, where family horrified And, you know, at failed system, their 69-year-old relative found themselves in hospital having lost 40 kilograms. And, you know, and my thought to self was, well, hang on, how come you, dear relatives, letting lose 40 kilos in the first place?
That's what we thought. We watched that and we were saying exactly the same thing.
And so I think it's about all of us learning how to navigate that in a responsible and, dare I say, sustainable fashion. Yeah.
And just last question, Wendy.
I'm sorry, I'm going to take you back from this. It's a very interesting discussion back on a few questions before, because I actually was interested to hear from you as well about how you identified the idea in your process from idea stage. Rolf said that there are many good ideas, it's about execution, and the writing is so important. I guess I was interested. So,
Yes.
Sorry to take it back.
No. It's an interesting thing because Rolf, he creates the world, and I work with an existing world. So the origin stories are so very, very different, and that's a really good question. I think I'll answer it with a specific example. I've just got picture lock on a film called A Portrait of Love, and we have two friends, Craig and Roberto, and Craig was at the beginning of this year, 4th of January, died after a brief illness. He was 53 years old, and Rolf was in Adelaide and I was at home in Tasmania, and we were both very, very shocked and saddened by this news. And you know, sort of 2-3 days later, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I went, "That's it." And I had been in contact with Roberto, but I contacted Roberto and I said, "Roberto, I'm moving with indecent haste here, but I would like to make a documentary about you and Craig and your love story, and I'd like to use the footage you have shot." And it was my way of dealing with the grief and the suddenness of it all. And so Roberto's like, whoa, okay, well, I was just, you're coming to the ceremony on Friday, we'll talk about it then. But I had seen enough of the footage that Roberto had shot, and I thought, he shoots a lot, he shoots well, he's got a really good eye. And I moved quickly with this project because I thought there's a potential funding opportunity that I could have with the Adelaide Film Festival that was screening in October. Rolf was in Adelaide. I thought, at this time, what are we doing so far away from one another? This project could get me in, to Adelaide, and I can reduce the budget of my project by, Rolf's renting an apartment. I'll stay in that apartment. I was
doing post-production in Adelaide on the survival economists.
Yes, and so there was all those things. So I see this poor grieving man, and I'm asking him for his footage and everything else like that. And I was very keen to work with an editor, Sam, and I called up Sam and said, "Right, I've got a project for us, let's go, starting in 3 weeks." She said, "But Molly, I'm busy." I went, oh, okay, well that's one, that was a hitch. Anyway, I'm telling a lot of detail here, and I realise I'm not answering the question well. But that was sort of how that project came to me, and I know where I'm going with it. And Sam said, "I'm busy," and I went, for the immediate future. I'm like, but I need to move fast on it for these other reasons. And then I shifted things, and I said to Rolf on the phone, I said to Sam, no, I really should have given her the opportunity to say, no, I've readjusted my schedule, I'm not too busy for this project. And Rolf, in all his wisdom, says to me, well, Molly, you better make sure you've got a film here. You know, have you looked at the material? I went, oh, good point. And so I headed back up, and Roberto and I went through the material, and all credit to him, and he had 5,000 videos. Yes, I know.
5,000 little, like 1 minute phone videos.
Oh, yes, and so of their life together.
And messages to other people and all of that stuff that you do in daily life. Yeah.
And so it that was how that project came to bear. Unfortunately, we did have the footage, and Sam and I spent almost 16 weeks working together to craft story, and I think as it stands now, oh goodness, this is going to be one of my favourite yet. So the origin stories come about in different ways. I know that Lauren had an experience at work this week, and she was telling me about it, and I went, oh goodness gracious, that's an interesting experience to have had. And 2 days later, I'm like, my goodness, there's a documentary in that, and it's not one that I could ever sort of see happening for a number of reasons. But I think that, back to your point, Mark, is why I'm partly very forensic in the way in which I approach life. I'm really interested in stories and things that are happening, and I think in some ways it's my mind looking for the stories that can and ought to be told.
If I can add something to that, and when a work comes into being for me, it's not sure. I know the intellectual stuff about having to work hard and so on, but it's what I call, it has poetry. Okay. Now, what I mean by that is there are a number of different things that coincide. So, in Molly's case, the poetry was a very interesting relationship between two people. One of them dies of COVID. The existence of all of this material of Roberto, the fact that I'm in Adelaide doing post, and then she could join me and we could live in the same place and use that to save money. And okay, that becomes something that there's poetry in that.
Serendipity.
Well, I guess so. Serendipity, call it that, but it's not serendipity, it's because you are identifying things. Okay? And that's something. And so, for me, most of the things I do, they have a sudden moment where I realise the poetry. And I go, my goodness, there's this, we can do this like this. And it's about production, and it's about life, and it's about all sorts of things. Okay? But it suddenly feels, this is something that is all coming together for all the right reasons. And it's very early. It's very early on in the piece. There may be no script, there may be whatever, no. And so, with the survival of kindness, I had, which is now, will be out next year. I had been working for 3 years on a big project that was a great passion of mine, very difficult, not cheap. It looked like it was financed, and it was completely and utterly brought down by COVID. And so I didn't know what to do. And then I began to poke around and think about things, and I needed to do some things. I needed to make another film. I needed to work out how to do things differently. I needed this and that. And suddenly things started to come together, where the need to make a film, the need to make a COVID nimble film, the fact that South Australia and Tasmania were the two best COVID states for filmmaking.
Or non-COVID states for filmmaking.
Well, yes, in the COVID times, they were the two best places. And then the story, where to shoot it and how to shoot it, came together from South Australia into Tasmania, and it all started to come together in a way where you thought, My goodness, and this is like very low budget, which has to be that, otherwise there's nothing done, you know, etc. And yeah, and so there was this poetry, and suddenly it's extremely exciting at the point where you realise that there's poetry, that there are production influences and creative influences and life influences and content influences that all somehow make a difference. And then I've got my poetry, and I think, yeah, I've got to go here. And
Would you or have you made something up here, not Queensland?
I was originally, I've been here, I've been to Cooktown and Hope Vale for weeks to do a project that ultimately it fell. It was not me. I was commissioned to write the screenplay, and I spent some 6 months or so on it, and then I stopped paying, and so it stopped. But yes, I would make a film here.
That'd be good. I noticed Upright at the moment is set up here. I'm waiting to see what it's going to be like.
Right.
Yeah. Because
Okay.
Tim mentioned so wonderful.
That's all right. That's maybe a good place to end. Thank you very much. We ran way over time, but thanks so much for your generosity, and let's